Hello out there in YouTube land and fellow do-it-yourselfers for the Nissan Xterra. My name is Jordan. Welcome back to the Flying Dollar. Today we're working on the 2008 Nissan Xterra that I affectionately call the Material Girl. Today I'm going to be showing you how to replace your fan clutch and your water pump or fan pulley bracket. It could be called either one. I think I looked it up and it was called a fan pulley bracket. The little background on this story, as you guys know if you've been watching the channel, I pulled this thing out of a pseudo storage last year when I got back from Germany and drove it all the way from the East Coast to Colorado. I was having a couple of cooling issues on that trip. I kind of attributed it to towing a trailer and having it fully loaded with gear and not really being built for highway traveling. It was never overheating, but it was running pretty hot, hotter than it normally does. And I did a couple things to try and remedy that, flush the coolant, and did all that, replaced the coolant temperature sensor, replaced the thermostat. All seemed to be fine, but I did it anyway because it's cheap and not too hard to do. But after a month of being here in Colorado or so, maybe two, the fan clutch seemed to be having some issues. Normally when your fan clutch goes bad, you have overheating issues because it won't engage. Well, mine was doing just the opposite. Mine was constantly on, and it is still constantly on. Normally, with a thermal fan clutch like this, what we have versus a non-thermal, there is something that senses the temperature of the engine bay area, not so much the engine itself. But I believe it's this, based on my research. This little coil senses the temperature, and there is a fluid in here. It's a viscous clutch that when this reads it, it activates the clutch. The plates inside expand, and it kind of it engages then, and it turns on when you're thinking it's really hot. So mine seems to be stuck on all the time. It doesn't just come on at the light. It comes on when you start it, which is fairly normal. It's supposed to come on a little bit until it figures out what it's supposed to be doing, and then it never really turns off, and it's on all the time. And that draws a little power from the engine, and in turn, what I believe it has done, because I thought I had this replaced by someone, which now I'm thinking I didn't. I think they just told me they replaced it and they didn't. We'll see what it looks like when I pull it out of there. But in turn, I believe that it has caused the pulley on, or the bearing on the fan pulley to go bad. I didn't know what was going on. I had this sudden whistle that would come on under load at like 3,000 RPM or above. At first I thought it might have been a belt, but it didn't really sound like a belt screech, and I checked the belt and it seemed tight. So then I thought that maybe it was a vacuum leak. I don't know much about vacuum leaks. The only way I know to test for one really is to spray something flammable like a carb cleaner in there around the edges of where you might think it might be, like the head gasket. And if you get a sudden increase in RPM, that indicates that you may have a vacuum leak there. Well, I did that and nothing happened, so I was kind of at a loss. I didn't have a vacuum test or anything, and I really don't know how to do that. So I went to a buddy of mine who I drive by his house every day before he was a friend of mine, and he's got a lifted rock crawler Jeep, a lifted Toyota 4Runner. He's got a full-on Evo build with the engine and the suspension all out in his garage. So I said, and then he had a Shelby Cobra Super Snake show up in his garage at one point, and I said, this guy and I we must be kindred spirits. So I stopped by and asked him to help me diagnose a little bit, thinking he might know a little more than I did. And we did. What we did was we took the belt off and drove it around, and that sound stopped. So that kind of eliminated it, that it was probably a vacuum leak. So we started looking at the pulleys and stuff like that. I went ahead and replaced the idler pulley and the belt tensioner, just because they're right on top and they're the easiest to do and they're super cheap. I just went ahead and replaced them. I threw some parts at it. Still had it. So because the reason I did that is because it's really hard to narrow down where the sound was coming from under there, because it's so loud, especially with the fan always on. So I think what we've narrowed it down to is the fan pulley. And like I said, it makes sense because this being on all the time may cause premature wear. So that's what we're going to do today. Keep in mind that as I go through this, my Xterra is modified, so there might be a few things that are different, and I'll try to point those out. But the process should be pretty much the same once we get past the airbox. Okay, let's go. Okay, so this is what you're going to need for this job. Biggest thing is a 14mm ratchet and socket. Most of the bolts for the brackets are held on with this. One of them, to get to, I needed a 3/8 inch drive. This is a 10mm bolt on a 1/4 inch. I use the 10mm for the fan itself and the fan pulley bracket, or not bracket, I'm sorry, the fan pulley fan clutch pulley. Had to use a couple of wrenches because there's a couple spots where it's not deep enough that you can get a socket in here. Had to use this to use the fan, or excuse me, the why can't I think of the word here? The tensioner. But you could use a 3/8 inch if you wanted to. We just used this because it was a little stronger. Remember, I used, or I'll be using this for to hold the fan in place. You'll see that a little later in the video. If you have zip tie engineering like me, it's okay. No shame in it. You'll need one of these. And if you're like me and you have poor dexterity and you drop every nut and bolt that you pull out, one of these is cool to have. Little magnet. And then these are the bolts that we'll show you what we use these for here. You may not need these, you may need them, but when we get to that point in the video, you'll see it. Okay, so the first thing you got to do to get to the area where the fan clutch is remove your intake tube. Now, like I said, a couple things. Your air box is going to look a little different. It's just going to be a solid box. If you don't have a cold air intake kit like I do, or if you do have a cold air intake kit, you'll have replaced all of this. Mine's a quick fit, so it doesn't replace this. Don't worry about that. You don't even need that. And this little shiny anodized red thing, you might not have this if you don't have it. This is a throttle body spacer. And of course, your cover will be black. I painted mine red because some tuner guy told me that painted red parts give you horsepower. But you just start by removing a couple of these screws right here at your hose clamps, and you can kind of flip this back after you do these two bolts back here. Keep in mind there is a hose over here. I'm just going to flip mine back and leave it attached. You can take it apart if you want to. Okay. All right, so what you're looking at down here is your belt assembly. Now, this is your idler pulley. Like I said, I've already replaced that just to help eliminate the issue. And then this is your belt tensioner. Okay, and I've already replaced that. Down here, what you can see though, that's your fan clutch. It's what your fan is attached to. Okay, and that is attached to a pulley which rests on your fan clutch or your fan pump bracket. So the first thing you got to do is take off your belt. Now, before you do this, you might want to take note of how it's wrapped or how it's routed around these pulleys so that you don't get it wrong when you put it back on. You can take a picture or you can just Google it at the end. Right before you put it back on, you can find pictures on the internet that make it pretty self-explanatory. I will see if I can find one and post it in the video. I'm going to try to get this in here, but the easiest way to take this belt off without really messing it up is using your fan tensioner or your belt tensioner. There is a little square right here at the end of this tip. It's kind of hard to see if I can show it to you. All right, well, I can't get a great angle to it, but right here, there's a little square. That is the perfect size for a 3/8 inch ratchet or a breaker bar or whatever you have. It's a 3/8 inch. You just put it on there and you kind of crank it down and it will loosen the tensioner so you can slide the belt off and then you can pull it all the way off. See how I just put it on there and slide it off. All right, forgot to tell you a couple other things you may see different is one, don't pay attention to my janky trail repair. These were an emergency fix on the trail at one point. And this area here, these are supposed to have, these two hoses should be clamped in here with a nice bracket over it that you would have to pull off to get these up out of the way. My clamps were broken based on some shoddy work from an outside mechanic, but you just pull the tops off of them and they unclip and you can zip tie these up out of the way just like I did so you can get down in there. Okay, so next you're going to have to remove your tensioner. If you're just doing the fan clutch, you don't have to do the tensioner, but if you're trying to do the pulley bracket, the tensioner is attached to that bracket. I'm going to give you a little extra room. It's a 14 millimeter. I would keep this 14 millimeter out because I think you're going to need it again. Obviously put it back on, but if you were replacing your fan tensioner. This is where you'd be at that point in the thing. You just put your new one back on. You can see this is the 3/8 inch square that I was talking about. You just put your 3/8 inch socket or ratchet in there and crank on that to get it loose. You can see on the back, this is where your mounting bolt would go through, and this is a set pin that you would see a hole on the front of the water pump bracket that it would match up to. Okay, if your goal here was to pull your idler pulley, that's right here, and that's easy. It's one bolt. I believe it's also a 14 millimeter. Now here's the problem. When you're looking at this, you spin the fan, you see that the fan clutch with the fan and the fan pulley all turn. However, when you go to crank on these, you're going to notice, try to take this thing off, you're going to notice that the fan can spin independently of the clutch. So when you start cranking on these, you're going to start spinning this and you're going to try to hold this in place maybe to hold it tight, and it won't work because as you hold it, see, it spins freely. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, and that's because, like I said, the fan clutch engages when it gets hot enough in here to where the car thinks it needs the fan to help additional cooling. So these 4 bolts here that mount the fan clutch to the fan pulley are 10 millimeter. Now, you're not going to be able to get a socket with a ratchet in here just because this area is too narrow, even for a like a 3/8, even for a 1/4 inch drive. I already tried it. It's too small. So to hold this in place, there are special tools, I believe, called, you know, fan pulley tools or whatever. I don't know, but I don't have one of those. I'm going to do it old school. So I'm going to take a flathead screwdriver and I'm going to try to wedge it under one of those bolts and see if I can hold this thing still. I'm going to put my wrench on here and see if I can crank this thing loose. Doing this. Oh, and it worked. Okay. So you're going to have to probably do that for every one of them. And try not to drop your tools. I'm going to try to show you. You see what I would do to wedge this in would be take a bolt right here, slide your screwdriver in, and then kind of rotate it. And then you'll be working on the bolt that's on the top right. Okay, so at this point I've got my 4 bolts removed. You should just be able to pull your fan clutch and your fan, the whole assembly, right off those 4 bolts. Now the tricky part is going to be getting it out of here because it's still kind of attached, so that's going to be the tough part. Okay, so I've been trying to finagle the fan out while it's still attached to the fan clutch for the last few minutes, and I can't figure it out, how to get it out of here without taking something off. Now, you can either take the shroud off, which is a couple of pretty bolts, but there's a lot of stuff attached to it, which I think is going to be an extra hassle, and you can't get it out from underneath, even on mine with my aftermarket bumper, which makes it much easier to get to, and your stock one's really not going to be that easy to. So I think what I'm going to do is take these coolant hose brackets off. There's a bolt under here on each one of them. That's a 10 millimeter bolt. I think I'm going to take those off and see if that gives me the space to maneuver that I need. Okay, so this is your old fan clutch and fan assembly. This is what the new one looks like. You'll see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts. These are 10 millimeter bolts that you attach the fan to. Make sure that this is marked so it makes it easy. It says front. If you get this thing on backwards, you're going to be ending up sucking air away from your engine rather than pushing it towards it and cooling it off. If yours isn't marked, if you have an aftermarket or something, just take a mental note of it or a picture or something so you know which way the fans need to go. Additionally, to get this thing off, removing those 2 coolant line brackets did work. We were able to wedge it out, but we also had to take this off. This is the fan pump pulley itself. You're going to have to take this off anyway, but it literally just slides on. It is pinched between your fan clutch and your water pump bracket, kind of like this. So here's your water pump bracket. It has its own pulley on it. Sits on it like that, and then this sits on it. So you have to pull that off too. That gave us an extra couple millimeters to get it clear. All right, so at this point, you want to go ahead and remove, there's 3 bolts that hold, or 4 bolts, excuse me, that hold on your fan pulley bracket. You can see Corbin's got one there. There's one right up there at the top here behind his knuckle. One down there, and there's one for a little bit further below the bracket. Okay, these are 14 millimeter bolts. They're all pretty easy to access now that you got everything apart in there. But they're probably on there pretty darn tight, so you may need a breaker bar or a big broad-shouldered man like Corbin here to help you out. There you go. Okay, so at this point, you have to remove your studs from your fan pulley bracket. As you can see, there's nothing in the back. They're not something you can take off. So Corbin is teaching me a method for this. I'm gonna let him take it from here.
Yeah, so the standard nuts, the flat side that you can't get a wrench on when you're trying to double torque it. So we take two nuts all the way down, take it down to the bottom of the threads, hold it with a wrench and torque it down. Once it's torqued down, you easily just peel it back off. Yeah. So now
so what we did was he took the power drill and drilled this top one, torqued it down onto the bottom one.
And the second one would be the same. Just throw it all the way down.
Yeah. Now the problem here is that the flat ones that come with it, you can't put two of these together and get a wrench in between it. So Corbin luckily had a few of these extras. If not, you're gonna have to go to Home Depot and pick up a couple of these bolts with the right pitch and thread, or nuts, excuse me, and do it.
Hold it. Torque it, loosen it.
And then loosen it. Too easy. Just remember, if you're doing this, you probably want to pick up a couple of those bolts from Home Depot or AutoZone. Right. So as I had earlier, we had applied Parts Breaker or WD-40 or Parts Blaster to these before that little how-to that we just gave you, and by the time we were done, these just spun right out. So maybe you'll get lucky and that'll happen for you. Just buy some Parts Blaster, which every mechanic should have. And then putting them back in, same thing, you just thread them back in there. Okay, another thing to mention real quick before we get past this is that these things are not the same length on both sides. So the shorter end goes into your pulley bracket here. Okay, and then to get the ones to torque these down, Corbin's going to go over that with you.
Without them being too loose, you want a little bit higher tolerance. You're going to take the same thing on the top side of the threads, not the bottom side. Hold the wrench here, and then you can be able to torque it down.
So essentially you're tightening the two nuts together, like against each other.
Yeah.
Then you can...
Well, it's not gonna keep, it's too loose of a tolerance, so we're gonna have to get it all the way down here.
Okay.
Loosely tighten it down here and then actually get it torqued without... Yeah, it's not gonna hold. So right down here where it has more resistance.
Yeah, up against the non-threaded area.
That, use the top bolt just to get it tighter and hopefully keep that thread. So now I can't unloosen it by my hand like we saw the other ones. Yeah. This can't loosen itself right now out of the pulley bracket. So now we just gotta remove these by holding them one at a time. And the last one, you like to use the impact wrench and hopefully it won't unthread it. And now it shouldn't be hand loose to come out. Okay.
So repeat times 3 more. This is why it's good to have actual mechanics as friends, not people who just break stuff in the process like me. Okay, and at this point you can just go ahead and reinstall your 4 bolts for your fan pulley bracket. And you got to make sure that you have the correct side up, obviously, otherwise it won't. But easy way to tell is that's your mounting holes for your tensioner. Those will be on the top. And that's pretty much it. We'll get this tightened down, then you put your pulley back on here, mount your fan clutch back on there, and we'll get to that in a minute.
I think we went the other way on the way out. Yep.
This was a pain. Right. I got 1, got 2, got 3, got 4. Okay. Okay, so we've got it all mounted back up. Again, make sure you Google a picture of the routing for the fan if you're having any trouble. Even though we just did this last week with my idler pulley, we still were like, what did we do wrong? So we had to look it up again, just to double check. Make sure you put your brackets back on if you took those off for removal. And that should be it. Now we just go ahead and reattach my intake tube, and we're going to test it up, and hopefully it works. Again, if you have trouble getting this belt on, remember, use that 3/8 inch ratchet or breaker bar, whatever. Put it right here into this square port right here, and as you crank to the passenger side of the truck, you can see the tensioner moves and it loosens up the belt, and you can slide it on. You hold that down, slide the belt on. Okay?